But then we also have to ask about, so that we've just asked about domination, even indirect and silent domination of other groups. But what about self-domination? I think this is a really interesting question, right? There's a book here that I think you guys could read if you were interested, called Female Chauvinist Pigs, Women and the Rise of Raunch Culture. And it's by Ariel Levy. And she's a fascinating woman. A lot of people are reading this book these days. Ariel Levy kind of updates Betty Friedan's thesis of the feminine mystique, and she wants to ask, especially about women who participate in what she calls raunch culture, if they are not today kind of guilty of creating a new feminine mystique, right? A new set of norms and ideals. It's generated by men and women, these norms and ideals. But women today are having to live up to them and wanting to live up to them, right? So we can think also about the fact that outgroups can be self-dominating, right? They can internalize the narrative of the in-group in order to be able to better to fit in with the in-group and integrate into the in-group's world. And so hence the quote from the back of the book: if male chauvinist pigs of years past thought of women as pieces of meat, female chauvinist pigs of today are doing them one better, making sex objects of other women and of themselves. And so what Ariel Levy talks about is the Girls Gone Wild videos as a key example here. And she wants to ask, is it liberating for women to participate in Girls Gone Wild videos? Is it better for women to participate in Girls Gone Wild videos? And she's not convinced that it is, of course, because she sees Girls Gone Wild videos as quite problematic. They're kind of hollow, right? Especially when you think about it, women don't really get paid for being in these Girls Get Wild videos. They sign up for them usually when they're drunk. They're at a club. The girls will sign up together. The contracts are fairly solid, and there's not much of a way out then once you've signed up, and so that can be a problem for people. And of course, there's no payment involved for this kind of thing, right? So that's a problem for Ariel Levy, because what the Girls Gone Wild girls are doing is they are simulating stripper culture or raunch culture. But why would you simulate stripper culture or raunch culture? When you look at actual strippers, they get paid for what they do. When you look at actual porn stars, they get paid for what they do, right? Even though what porn stars and strippers are doing is itself a simulation of an authentic sexual act, i.e. a not real sexual act. It's just a fake, right? It's an act. Here, the female chauvinist pigs of today, the Girls Gone Wild girls, are doing this for free. So for Ariel Levy, that's a double problem, right? Because as if it wasn't bad enough that strippers had fake sexual experiences in order to get money, here we have these other girls doing it for free, just simply to be accepted in society. And so she has this big problem with that, because it's like a double move away from an authentic sexual experience that would actually be empowering or pleasant for women to have, with a genuine loving partner that would be somehow edifying or rewarding in that way, So one of the questions is, are Girls Gone Wild girls stupid, or are they oppressed? What is it? Well, perhaps they're both, because who has the power here? It's not clear that the men have the power over the women. I think the narrative has the power, the discourse has the power. And for this reason, we can talk about a shared text or a cultural text that can cause Girls Gone Wild to be perceived as normal by both men and women alike. And so we can say the story or the narrative has the power. That is, it can cause women to desire to become sex objects in this highly subservient way. And it can also cause men to desire women who become these objects. So the power is in the culture. I think it's very, very clear. It benefits men. It benefits men because men are the in-group, and so clearly we have to understand that the culture exists in order to reward men more than it does women. I think so. Clearly there is a bias here and a privileging here, but it's not clear that that the men are any more conscious of it than the women. And so in a way, the culture makes both men and women victims. I think that's a key point that Ariel Levy is trying to make. And so one of the things that we've got to ask about is how we can resist this, and of course that's something we'll think about in the rest of the lecture. We've got to talk about Marxist feminist critique of the second wave. If Ariel Levy is a sort of an up-to-date version of the second wave feminism, talking about the textuality of the patriarchy today in vis-a-vis Girls Gone Wild, then the feminist critique, the Marxist feminist critique of the second wave may be relevant to her here as well, although it's not clear that she's not aware of some of those things. But one of the key people to talk about here is Bell Hooks. She is a fascinating scholar in her own right. She believes that the second wave feministic perspective, it has a problem because it is quite white and middle class and heterosexual in its normative viewpoint. And so from Bell Hooks' perspective, that's a problem. Note, and by the way, she's Bell Hooks with a lowercase b and a lowercase h because she doesn't capitalize her name. That's a political thing that she does. So Bell Hooks is really suggesting here that the Enlightenment liberal underpinnings of the dominant male viewpoint that has shaped life in the United States since the time of its founding has also had a major role in shaping the expectations and hopes and dreams of second wave feminism. Because the philosophers of the Enlightenment that were so influential on the founding of this country talked about the equality of man, but not everybody was allowed to be a man in that sense, right? And what the second wave feminists were asking for and agitating for was the right to be accepted as an equal in the male world, okay? So hence the second wave feminists were looking for women to be allowed to be entered into certain types of jobs, like being a lawyer or being a doctor or being in advertising. If you watch the show Mad Men, you see that clearly the struggle of Peggy, the character in that show, to be accepted as an equal in the world of advertising. But there's a lot of people that don't get thought about in this analysis, right? What about the condition of poorer women who have to struggle and work without much reward of pay? How, for example, do undocumented immigrants who care for the children of career women fit into this picture, right? As more and more women are going to go to work in middle-class jobs, nannies and such are being hired, and daycare workers are being hired to look after the children at home, because this is part of the experience of progress in second wave feminism. And I don't think that Bell Hooks is trying to suggest that these women shouldn't have these jobs. It's not that she's trying to knock this idea, but she's saying that really the normative focus of the theory is what do these white middle-class heterosexual women do with their angst about being at home all the time and wanting to make career progress, wanting to self-actualize. But no one's asking the question of how these marginal women are self-actualizing, women of race, women of minority positions, who are often economically really quite a secondary concern to the women who are trying to get ahead in their careers. And so the question is, where is the power again? And what does it mean to try to say that women should be able to be equal to men in that context? Because if we look where these poorer women are, oftentimes we are also finding poorer men of racial backgrounds, racial minority backgrounds, etc. So there's this fascinating quote here from Bell Hooks that I think really captures a lot of that, the complexity of thinking about feminism from a kind of a class perspective, right? Or a Marxist perspective, if you want to call it that. And she says, since not all men are equals in white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal, it's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? Since not all men are equals in white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal class structures, which men do you want to be equal to? That's the important question. And so clearly, we've been talking about white middle-class women wanting to be equal to white middle-class men. and that's not entirely the full story, I think, is what we've been saying. Bell Hooks is making this rather controversial remark then, that second wave feminists have an overly white, middle class, female gaze perspective. When we say gaze, we mean perspective. The book also offers a quote from Karl Marx's friend Friedrich Engels, who claimed that the modern wife differs from a prostitute only in that she does not hire out her body like a wage worker on piecework, but sells it into slavery once and for all. So there is that kind of a Marxist perspective there on the plight of women, and I think that Marxist perspective opens us up to think about class structure alongside the structure of gender that we've been talking about to date. From this point of view, right, if we're going to think about class structure alongside this issue, then equal rights for women appears naive, because capitalist society would never pay to fully enable those rights to exist in a robust way. Women provide a lot of cheap labor, especially, and you can see this in the way that the success of second wave feminism has played out, right? Because now we have these white middle class women going off to get careers and self-actualize, while on the margins women are still suffering, right? Except they are from racially minoritarian backgrounds, or they're from minoritarian class backgrounds. And maybe Engels is onto a point there. Society really enjoys having that cheap labor at its disposal, and it's very hard to imagine how that would change unless the women and men in those subaltern positions were to get together and create power for themselves, to educate themselves, take their power back, so to speak, and revolt to a certain extent, or at least campaign for political privilege. But that's very hard when you don't have privilege in the first place, right? When you're already outside. But for bell hooks, the problem really is more caught up in the question of capitalism than it is in gender per se, I think, or not patriarchy at least. I wanted to talk to you a little bit. This is not discussed in your chapter, but I wanted to mention Nancy Fraser because she's very, very cool. She argues, much like bell hooks, she argues that there might be too many feminisms today, that as we've gotten so focused on patriarchy and finding out in ever more refined ways how patriarchy has limited this, that, or the other sort of micro-identity, that we found this pluralization of feminisms. We've got ecofeminism, we've got LGBT feminism, and all these different types of feminisms, and that's fine. I mean, I don't think Nancy Fraser is complaining too much about the fact that these groups have the right to exist. She's not exactly making the suggestion that they're politically incorrect or anything, but that if there are so many subgroups of this or that feminist group, each looking to be recognized, isn't there a possibility that the core message, the core mission, could get diluted and forgotten? I think that's what she's saying. So this creates the question of, if we've got all this fragmentation and people pursuing trendy subcultures and being very, very politically correct, this raises the question of how women can again return to being sort of unified as women, or to find a common platform amongst themselves for campaigning for rights as women. How do you, or in other words, how do you create unity in diversity? So Wibben raises the question in the chapter. I think it's interesting. If you're going to talk about creating unity and diversity, then that's no longer really a question about raising consciousness, right? It would be a question really about what you're raising consciousness about. There's not one notion of femininity now that we know this, right? There's not one notion of femininity out there that people can sort of campaign for. So the whole idea of what feminism is today for Fraser and for others changes. It's not about locking onto a feminism based on a certain type of femininity as a common platform for a forward momentum in terms of an agenda. It's about the critical moment of feminism and taking that critical moment of feminism and working with it, right? What do I mean by that? Well, it seems to me, and I think Wibben puts it well, that feminism really was a way of, this is on page 82, it's a way of challenging representation and confronting privilege and power, right? And I think that's the common thread that Hooks and Fraser and Wibben are really trying to lock into. It's the idea of what feminism taught us. It gave us a sense of critique. It gave us a sense of the possibility of critique to overcome adversity for subaltern groups. And that's what they're really trying to develop, I think, here. It is a robust sort of critical capacity that feminism has, as opposed to the power to create something like a solid definition of women that everyone can agree with. Why not retain the one thing? Why not say that to be feminine, to be a feminist, is simply to be critical, and forget about needing to sort of create this or that absolute definition of what it means to be a woman. In other words, for an openly critical movement, which I think is really, really interesting philosophically. So we're on to our last slide here now, which is, second last slide, approaches to identity. And this is, I think, where Anique Wibben in her chapter makes some really great arguments, actually, because she's starting to think now back from the case. We've been talking about feminism, right? And we've been talking about the different types of feminisms and the different types of approaches within it. And I think what she's starting to see now is that actually what we can extract from this conversation really are some different kind of notions about where we can take this thing, right? So think about it for a second. We've put on the table a sort of a second wave feminism. We've put on the table a more Marxist feminism, and we've also talked about Nancy Fraser and the idea or the hope of a feminism that is about criticism more than it is about saying what women are, what women ought to be, who's a woman, who is feminism for, how many types of feminism ought there to be, okay? So hopefully you've got those different movements. We've talked about 3 different movements, and I think, I might be wrong here, but I think what I'm reading in Anique Wibben as she closes her chapter and she starts to talk about different approaches to identity, I think she's giving us language there to talk about these 3 different types of approaches in a more concrete way. And that's my hypothesis, and that's how I'm going to read this chapter and how I'm going to discuss it with you, right? So we know that that it's becoming increasingly popular today to think about women's liberation. If we go back to the and to sort of accept it as a reality, right? It's become part of the status quo. We know if we go back to the Girls Gone Wild example, Ariel Levy, I didn't finish the point then, but I should have. But Ariel Levy notes that at the end of the Girls Gone Wild videos, she goes around to interview the girls who participated in Girls Gone Wild and asks them, why did you guys do that? I mean, is it very liberating for you? Why is that positive for you to take part in that? And the girls all respond, well, my mother fought for my freedom, my grandmother, my great-grandmother all fought for my liberation, so now I'm free, and I can do what I want with my body because I'm free. And, of course, Ariel Levy responds to that going, that's interesting, so this is what you're going to do with your freedom. That's really quite something. And so, that clearly is not a very salutary expression of that freedom if those girls are not getting anything sort of sexually edifying out of it for themselves, if they're not getting any sort of material advancement in terms of money for themselves, then, as we've said, they're twice removed from the authentic act, and it's kind of, from Ariel Levy's perspective, kind of doubly tragic, right? But we have to ask, and take seriously, I think, this idea that, at least from those girls' point of view, they're doing it. They're being liberated women. So clearly, then, patriarchal notions of femininity still survive, and they survive in these very subtle ways that are also incredibly powerful. And we're no longer in the age of direct domination of women, although in some instances that's still very true, especially in certain parts of the third world. But within Western society, obviously, terrible things still happen to women. But more and more, it seems that the power that keeps women suppressed, if you want to use that term, is a very subtle power. It's not a directly suppressive power. It's a power that involves women and recruits women and their sense of their ethical selves voluntarily in its reproduction. And I think that's very, very interesting for us to talk about. So here we want to ask about some of the ways in which that kind of recruitment, if you will, takes place for men and for women, right? For any women, the first category that we can think of is positivism, right? Positivistic theories of who women are and what men are. And one of the examples that she offers is John Gray's book, which is a pop psychology book that tries to give couples relationship advice based on the essential differences that John Gray perceives between men and women. And the book, of course, famously, if you've never read it, is Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, and we see John Gray has a PhD and is a New York Times bestseller. And it's the classic guide to understanding the opposite sex, that men are, men want to drink beer and watch football on television, and women want to raise children and be nurturing. And it's this whole sort of idea of Mars versus Venus, and if men and women are ever going to get along, they have to understand these fundamental realities about each other. And of course, the problem is, well, there's no problem, I suppose, really. I mean, loads and loads and loads of people read this book and took it very seriously. But the problem is, I suppose, from any women's perspective, and I think I'm persuaded by this to an extent, that as a kind of self-help book, right, the self-help book holds a mirror up to ourselves and asks us to check ourselves relative to the ideal that the self-help book is espousing. And the question for us is, well, do we want to really comport ourselves, to this model? I mean, is this really who we want to be, what we want to be? The book says it's who we ought to be. The book is setting out a version of us at our very best according to its parameters, right? But there's a trap. The book potentially is a trap because it says that that's what women have to be and that's what men have to be. But maybe not all men are beer drinking, football watching, right? So in that case, then the book falls short because not all men are from Mars, right? Remember we said that back in the first lecture, but when the cliched phrase "boys will be boys," or and I asked you to think about a British man, and you thought about the guy in the pinstripe suit. Well, classically here, men are from Mars is one of those things. Like imagine a man, close your eyes, and what pops into your head? Some guy who likes to drink beer and watch football on television. Well, that's not necessarily true, of course, and not all women are from Venus. Not all women want to have children and paint the bedroom pink if it's a girl, or blue it's a boy, So we have this kind of problem with people like John Gray insofar as they taking their book seriously makes us much more likely to try to adopt to the ideal roles that the book is describing for each gender. And the book therefore changes our expectations of who we are, changes our expectations from ourselves, and maybe makes us even judgmental of ourselves. It's potentially true that John Gray's work would make us very self-critical if we didn't feel that we lived up to the expectation. So that's an important point. And then we also have another category of thought called normativism, which I guess is might be considered to a certain extent. Even mainstream feminism has a certain amount of normative theory in it, but if John Gray's approach is positivistic, right? He's a scientist, right? He's approaching it from a scientist. Normative theory is not really so scientific as it is socially evangelical. It's preaching these ideals through a kind of a more heroic or cultural kind of complex. So normativism, classic example of normativism would be the John Wayne cowboy movie, itself, not through this kind of veneer of a scientific discourse, but like literally holding up in so many words the ideal of the cowboy. And we talked about that earlier on, didn't we? We talked about the example of Brokeback Mountain and how even against the barrage of normativity that comes from John Wayne movies, you can have a movie as well that shows clearly a contrarian example of on how that concept of masculinity can be expanded. So the problem with both of these approaches, whether it's the scientific positivist or the more sort of culturally normative theory, and that both approaches use broad brushstrokes. Indeed. And what we are interested in is a theory, in keeping with our argument which we just made on the last slide, an alternative approach that is not so much interested in creating solid definitions of what women are or what women ought to be, but an idea that is openly critical, right? And in doing so, views the life of every human being as a kind of a development, a work of art in progress, right? Something that's becoming rather than what is, right? Am I a man or a woman, or what am I becoming, right? You know, am I on my way to becoming a certain type of singular individual, rather than something that necessarily has to conform to the rules of being a man or a woman? And I think that's kind of interesting as well. That's so that's our third approach that we've been trying to outline. Now, if we are interested in dynamic approaches, and this is our last slide, we could do worse than turn to Judith Butler. I don't know if you guys have been following the news over the last few days, but this year, this is 2013, February 2013, and this year Nancy Fraser has been in the news for the fact that she was asked and invited to give a talk on the Israeli boycott and divestment movement, to try to get American colleges and universities to divest from consuming goods and services from Israel. And she was, it became controversial because many people wanted to shut it down because they thought it was anti-Zionistic, but that's a whole other debate. I think Judith Butler, the woman in the photo here, is clearly not an anti-Semite. In fact, she's probably the exact opposite. But I just wanted to let you know that she was in the news recently anyway, and that's something you guys can look into if you're interested. Her talk is available for you to read online that she gave at Brooklyn College there over the weekend, and that was the whole controversy. So if Judith Butler is an advocate of a dynamic approach, she's focusing in on the processes that make us appear whole to ourselves, right? And the advantage really of this approach is that it focuses in, often in meticulous philosophical detail, just how it is that we are creatures that need to be affirmed in the first place. Like, why do we need the other to affirm who we are? Why do we need to create somebody who's not us before we know what we are? And to make this argument, people like Butler often will refer to the psychoanalyst Lacan, and his idea that we suffer a lack, basically, as human beings. Sort of psychologically speaking, we're all suffering a lack. And what is that lack? Well, the problem is, that we, kind of building on Freud here, and the difficulty of the child in finding out that he or she as a baby does not literally have the right to consume the entire world, because of if you remember from thinking, maybe you've read about Freud, you've heard about Freud from another class. Freud famously argues that the father says no, right? And this is the beginning of the Oedipal complex. Well, for Lacan, it's not quite that sort of simple, but the idea is very similar. That what we see in the mirror, for example, when we look in the mirror, is not complete information. It's hard for us to know what we are, right? You can look in the mirror, I can look in the mirror, but what we see is not the full story, right? We know that the data that's coming to us through the image in the mirror is not necessarily all that we see, or we choose to focus on certain things. Other people focus on other things. We can't see the back of our heads, for example. So the difference then is something that needs to be dealt with and managed, right? The absence of a full sense of what we are. For Freud, the child doesn't have a full sense of what it is once the father denies its wholeness. And for Lacan, similarly, when we perceive ourselves in the mirror, we have to do something to compensate for the fact that we don't know the full story of who we are. And so what do we do? Well, the second move then, once we've looked in the mirror, is to try to create difference, to try to find something that is other to us in order to be able to create an artificial sense of affirmation of what we are. And of course, the problem is that if you take this perspective, if you understand the role of difference in this way as being that which affirms the thing that we don't have, how do I know I'm a rational human being? Well, because I look over there and I know they're irrational. And that allows me to overcome the doubt that I have, actually, fundamentally, that I am a rational human being. Yeah? Do you follow my drift? So by claiming other people are irrational, I can compensate for the fact that I'm actually kind of suspicious about my own rationality sometimes. But then the question is, if that's all that we are, right? If all that we are is a politics of scripting difference between me and them, then how do we have any control over this, right? How do we have any choices? And it's not clear what the answer to that question is, because if scripting is so powerful, if we're stuck in scripting ourselves vis-a-vis the other all the time, then it's hard to imagine how we could live in a world where we don't ever do that. But there are ways in which we can see openings and opportunities for exploring difference in a more accommodating manner. We can look at case studies, for example. Judith Butler talks about the drag queen, and that's cited in your textbook, but I went and I found a different quote that's not in your textbook because I wanted to see if there was a way I could focus down the point a little bit more. And I like this quote. It's a famous quote from Judith Butler. She says, "There is no original or primary gender a drag imitates, but gender is a kind of imitation for which there is no original." So we don't normally know that, right? Because as we've been saying, we're stuck in processes where we have a lack in our group, our in-group, for example, that we overcome by ascribing difference to another group and holding that other group to account for that difference. So I like that a lot, right? But the drag queen comes along and shows, in fact, that rather than this kind of artificial wholeness that we generally try to manufacture through our politics, the drag queen frivolously and playfully reveals to us that the wholeness that we think we've got, in fact, is really an imitation, right? That when we look at the mirror, again, we're not as masculine or feminine as we think we are. We're all kinds of incomplete. We're all kinds of falling apart, in fact. And that's really kind of liberating for us. It's liberating to be reminded about that. That the things that we're paranoid and anxious about, our gender, our sexuality, maybe they're not such a big deal after all. Like, I don't need to get angry if I'm at a bar and a gay man comes up to me and tries to chat me up, right? It's not challenging my gender. I don't care, right? He's because after all, masculinity, as Judith Butler is saying here, is kind of an imitation anyway. It only exists in science fiction shows and in cowboy movies, a la John Wayne. And no one really is like John Wayne anyway, because John Wayne only exists in the movies. And even in real life, John Wayne wasn't John Wayne, if you know what I mean. Right? So, fact versus fiction, the reality is that a lot of our guiding sort of heroes and ideologies come to us through television shows and movies and novels, and rarely does that kind of individual exist in real life. No one's story is ever black and white. So the drag queen has a nice way of revealing that to us. And so I think that's the conclusion of the lecture, really, that these kind of spaces, Annie Quibbin says on page 91, that maybe dynamic approaches don't really need to think about why we have agency, if we have agency at all, or how we escape from the text, because that's not the point, right? The point is to do what the drag queen does, to look at where identities collide and look at where identities have to be negotiated and find in those spaces opportunities for opening. Not that we can change the world all in one go, not that we can ever escape textuality, not that we can ever escape scripting, but that we can, through a playful attitude maybe, cultivate within ourselves a willingness to be present in those moments where openings happen, and to understand that they're negotiated, and to maybe use them as learning moments about ourselves. And I really like that idea. So such spaces, I think, is what Anique Webben is trying to say, and I think this is what Judith Butler is trying to say. Such spaces are probably the places where we have our best chance at making progress and at moving this thing forward. to find out whether we're privileged or not, to find out whether we are othering this person that we're encountering, you know, holding them somehow inferior to us if we're part of an in-group or what have you. Or if you're a subaltern group, trying to understand maybe better how you can relay that to the person you're encountering who might be more powerful than you. That's interesting as well. So anyway, there you go. That's the end of the lecture, guys. Enjoyed it this week. Good topic, I think, and I will look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. Take care. Bye-bye.